Hello again. It's time to pit two entry-level pressure fermenters against each other. It's the Kegland All-Rounder versus the Keg King Snub Nose. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing these two PET pressure fermenters and discussing the different features and the pros and cons of each model and which one I think comes out on top. So before we start, I'd just like to point out that while I was sent one of the snub noses for the purpose of the previous review video, this video is not part of that sponsorship arrangement, if you want to call it that. And in fact, Keg King didn't really want me to do a direct comparison because of the obvious issues that could be brought up there with bias with a video like that. So this video is purely based on my own experience and opinions on these two fermenters versus each other, and is not endorsed by either company or sponsored by either company in any way. Now, if you do find the information in this video useful, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button, like the video, and maybe drop a comment in below. And you can also follow me on the social links, which are on the screen now and in the description. So let's get into it. I'd like to start with the pricing. At a glance, you might think that the all-rounders are significantly cheaper than the snub noses. If you go online, you can see that you can pick up the base unit on its own for about £57 currently. But we've got to bear in mind that isn't ready and set up for pressure fermentation. So in order to do that, you need to add some additional components such as carbonation caps, dip tube and float, and the spunding valve. Now you can buy all of that as a package from quite a few retailers, and that's going to come in at around £90 to £95 on average. The snub nose, on the other hand, does come ready for pressure fermentation out of the box. One small difference, though, you need to bear in mind is that its pressure is controlled by variable PRVs rather than a spunding valve. If you do use a spunding valve, that gives you more control over the pressure setting, and it works as an additional safety feature. Price-wise, the snub nose comes in at around £95 to £100 at its standard pricing, although at the moment you can pick it up a bit cheaper than that, so it's going for £85 at the moment over at Brew Keg Tap. So when we look at the two in comparison, if you talk about the setup ready to pressure ferment with all the required components, the pricing is pretty similar between the two. But that's not quite the whole story. So if we look at the snub nose, it does come with some additional features out of the box, and there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the quality or specification of some of the components that are used there. For example, as standard out of the box, you've got a thermal well, stainless steel thermal well, you've got a stainless steel hop filter, the posts on it are also stainless steel, and you've also got a little hop port in the top of the lid as well, which you can use to add hops, obviously, and other things without having to remove the lid entirely. In addition to that, obviously, there is a difference in terms of shape. So you've got the conical base on the snub nose versus the rounded base on the all-rounder, which we'll talk more about shortly. Before we go into what those additional features can actually do for you on the snub nose, let's just look at how much it would cost to bring the all-rounder up to a similar kind of specification. So if we're going to add onto the all-rounder a thermal well, some steel carbonation caps and a hop filter, that's going to bring the total pricing up to around £111 in total. Now, I haven't included a hop port in that because there isn't a kind of like-for-like equivalent. There are some options that you could use, but they tend to be more expensive. So things like, tri-clamp lids and so on, and the additional accessories that can come with those. But you can effectively do the same thing just by removing one of the carbonation caps. So it didn't really seem worth including that in that kind of price comparison. That said, once we look at those prices when they're kind of at the same sort of spec in terms of features, and bear in mind you'd also have to fit the thermal well yourself, so that would include drilling the lid, which is a bit of extra hassle. I think pricing wise, actually the snub nose does represent better value, and you get more for your money with that particular model. So it's the snub nose that wins on that criteria for me. So let's talk a little bit about the overall design and dimensions of the two fermenters. The obvious difference that you can see is the conical shape on the snub nose and the rounder shape on the all-rounder. That means that this one has to have a different design for the stand as well. And as you can see, there is a difference in height between the two of them. So the snub nose in the stand without connectors on the top, which will add a little bit more height as well, comes in at around 59 centimeters tall, whereas the all-rounder is about 52 centimeters, as you see it here, with the stand in the lower kind of profile arrangement. That does have one important implication in terms of getting these into a standard under-counter fridge. I don't think you're going to be able to do that really with the snub nose. It's just going to be too big in most cases for a standard fridge. The all-rounder, even with the smaller capacity under-counter fridges, which I know a lot of people in the UK in particular use for fermentation chambers, can be made to fit in there. You might need to sort of make your own kind of shelf with a cutout to hold it rather than using the base, and maybe tilt it on its side and things like that. But it does give you the flexibility to do those things, and you'll see lots of examples online of people using it in that way. So while the snub nose obviously features the conical base, which is great, it does mean that potentially it's not going to be that useful in terms of fitting it into fermentation chambers that a lot of people out there are using. So I think because of that, I would have to say in terms of the kind of compactness and the dimensions, the all-rounder is probably going to work better for a lot of people. So I'll give the Kegland model a win on that criteria. So let's talk a little bit more about that conical base and why you might want to have that. So in theory, the conical base is going to help to bring together the trub and sediment and yeast and dry hops, if you're adding them, all together into a more tight kind of compact cone at the bottom of the fermenter, which theoretically can help the beer to clarify more quickly, and it can also mean that you get a better yield out of the fermenter as well, because it's easier to collect the beer off of the top of that. So in my experience so far, I wouldn't say that there's an obvious difference in terms of how quickly the beer clarifies or how well stuff flocculates out of it. But I would say that I've definitely noticed that the yield and the ease of getting the beer out of the snub nose is better than what I get with the all-rounder typically. Now, one of the reasons for that is the Fermenter in the center also acts as a guide for the dip tube and the filter. So there's a little loop on there which goes over the Fermenter, and basically as it goes up and down, it follows the Fermenter right down the center of the FE. That means we don't have to worry about it kind of getting stuck on the sides, which is something which can happen with the all-rounder. And also you're not going to need to kind of tilt the fermenter or move it around in any way, which again is something that I have found is necessary with the all-rounder to try and get those last few litres out of the FE as you're transferring it. The snub nose, that filter will go right down into the centre of that cone and pretty much get all of the work above that layer of trub in the bottom of the FE. With the all-rounder, sometimes when you are tilting it over, if you're trying to get a little bit extra out, that can rouse the sediment up or the dry hops, and sometimes that can cause the filter or the dip tube to block. And again, that might mean that you don't manage to get as much beer out of it in the end. So essentially, if you have got the space to accommodate it, then I do find, in my experience, that the conical base is an advantage, and it does make this one perform a little bit better, certainly in terms of the transfers and the yield, than the all-rounder. So I'll give the win to Keg King on that one. Looking at the kind of general build quality and how easy they are to set up, both of them are pretty straightforward, to be honest, so there's not any major complaints. I would say that with the all-rounders, in some cases it can take a little bit more tweaking to get them working perfectly. The seals are not always great with the carbonation cap, so I have found that on one of them I've needed to use plumber's tape just to make sure that those are gas tight and seal up properly. The filter. If you add a filter to the dip tube, then it does benefit from having some extra weight added to it. So again, you need to do a little bit of tweaking to make that kind of work properly. You can achieve that just by adding a little kind of stainless nut onto the end of the dip tube. Now, admittedly, in the video where I reviewed the snub nose, I did talk about changing out the dip tube for a slightly thicker silicone tube because I found that didn't work perfectly at first. But other than that, and bearing in mind the slightly higher spec components that we've already discussed, I think that for me, out of the box, looking at build quality, the snub nose is a bit better, and it seems to work a little bit better without having to kind of fiddle around with things. So that's based on my experience of having two of each of these. Haven't had the snub noses for as long, so I would be interested if any of you out there have also used both of these fermenters, what your thoughts are on that, whether you think there is a difference in sort of overall build quality between the two of them. Let me know in the comments. So just some other points related to functionality and ease of use. I do prefer the stand for the snub nose. Obviously it has to have a different stand because of the design, but it does hold it more securely. It means it's not going to kind of slide around in the stand. That is something that I have noticed with the all-rounder, particularly when it doesn't have any beer in it yet like it is now. It can kind of slide around on the stand a little bit, and if there's any weight on the top, so if you've got the lid kind of balanced on the top, it can topple over, lid might end up on the floor, and then you need to clean that and sanitize it and so on. That has happened with the transfer line going as well, so if it topples over at that point, obviously you can end up with work going over the floor and a bit of a mess from that. Speaking of the lids, I have found that the one on the snub nose is a little bit easier to remove, so it uses a slightly thicker, softer O-ring for the fit, which is therefore a little bit looser. On the all-rounder, it's a little bit more of a tighter kind of pressure fit on there. Sometimes that can mean it gets a little bit stuck and you might need to try and sort of lever it off with something. Obviously that does risk causing a little bit of damage to the plastic, potentially the seals as well. A lot of people will say, oh, you can just pop it off by adding a little bit of pressure into it. I prefer not to do that. Basically because I just don't really like the idea of firing lids off under pressure. Even if the collar is on there, there's still potential if you cock that up for it to, you know, come off at speed, which is something that we want to avoid, especially if you are looking down on it from the top at the time. I've already mentioned about the transfers being a bit easier with the snub nose in my experience, and also we've obviously got some additional functionality from the Fermenter and the hot port. Although for me personally, I wouldn't say that either of those are particularly kind of deal breakers in terms of whether I would choose one or the other. So other than those points, I think functionality and user experience is kind of similar between the two of them. But I would say that for me, in my experience, the snub nose just edges it on that front. So let's talk about availability and actually being able to get your hands on these products. So Keg King are not as well established in the UK market as Kegland. You can find their products at a wider range of retailers now, but they're not as well stocked or as widely available as the all-rounders and Kegland products generally. And that also applies even more so to the kind of accessories and upgrades and spare parts, which you can pick up for the Kegland products. Just to give you an example, with the snub nose, if you wanted to get one of the cooling coils for that, those are not currently available in the UK. There are cooling jackets that you can get hold of, and there's no kind of alternative lid options, so you can't currently purchase a lid that's got like a tri-clamp fitting on it, for example. And that means that things like the kind of hot bong accessories and various other items which you can use with all-rounders and the other Kegland fermenters, that's not something that you can do with the Keg King stuff at the moment. That's not a big thing for me, but I know a lot of people will want to have those options available to them. So really, as far as, availability of the fermenters themselves, but also all the other accessories and products that can go with them, I would have to say that Kegland are a clear winner on that criteria. So finally, just to talk about durability, I've had the all-rounders for a number of years now, and They are great. I haven't had any issues with them, not exploded any of them so far. And in fact, today I've actually pressure tested both of them to 35 psi, and there's no issues there. So yeah, I think they will last, if you treat them well, longer than the sort of stated shelf life. And if you do pressure test them, pretty much you can say, okay, well, they should be good for another couple of years. So have no issues with those as far as durability. Obviously, they are made of plastic, so you've got to treat them with a certain level of care. Scratches and things like that can be an issue if that happens. But yeah, I think they've lasted really well for what they are, and I haven't had to replace any of the major components on those. I've only had the snub noses for a few months, so I can't really comment on the durability of those. I've got no reason to think that they wouldn't last just as well, if not better than the all-rounders. The plastic is a little bit thicker on the snub noses. I think that's partly because of the shape of them. You probably need to have the thicker plastic in order to have the conical base be stable and not kind of just blow out when you put it under pressure. But yeah, it's a question mark for durability for those because I haven't had them long enough really to make a judgment on that. So just to summarize, for me, as you've probably guessed, the Keg King snub nose is my preference. I think it offers better value, better features, and better user experience out of the box. But there's not a huge amount in it. And as I said, looking at the kind of dimensions and stuff, some people will choose between these just based on what will work best with their particular setup. And I certainly wouldn't hesitate to recommend the all-rounder if it does work better with maybe the fermentation chamber that you've got, or you want to have access to those upgrades and accessories that we mentioned. It's still a really great bit of kit and a fantastic way to get into pressure fermentation and all the additional benefits that you can get from that, like closed transfers and harvesting CO2 and all the other fun stuff that you can do. I've got a few videos related to all that stuff on the channel, and I'll put some links to those in the description as well, by the way, so go and check those out. So yeah, they're both great options. I prefer the snub nose, and that's what I'm going to be using moving forwards. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. So jump into the comments, especially if you've got experience of using either of these fermenters, or maybe both of them, and you've got your own views on which one you prefer. Let me know about that. And yeah, let's see what you think. Cheers, everyone.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, that or his dudeness or duder or, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.